I want to talk to you today about the idea of demystifying acoustics. Everyone who's presented so far has talked about more of the technical nuances, the human factor associated with budding research and applicability of acoustics in the built environment. And not all of that is accessible, and many of us have talked about that so far. So I want to talk about ways that we can continue the conversation on acoustics to work towards more accessible pathways to ultimately lead to high-performing spaces that incorporate high-performing acoustics. Before we do that, again, there's my face from 2 years ago. I have a background in acoustical consulting. I'm also vastly interested in the nature of subjectivity of sound, music, the way we interact in space. And bringing that into the idea of high-performing spaces, I wanted to pose a question in asking what a high-performing space means to you. What do you envision when you think of a high-performing environment? I think for me, or maybe many of you too, it might have to do with the amount of focus you have at a workplace, or the amount of connectivity or warmth that you feel in a space where you can connect with others in a social environment. Or it could be the extent to which you have control over your environment, whether that's access to daylight, or ergonomics, or organization at your workstation. But what we're seeing with the descriptions of high-performing spaces is that they have this visual component that we can easily latch onto with memory and experience, and not necessarily the sonic experience that we are all a part of all the time, as we're always listening. And I think this is unfortunate because it doesn't tell the whole story. When we think about this space, when I thought about how I was going to present and convey this information to you, I knew that I had a microphone, and I knew that I would be in a space that would have a sound system and convey my message. But I didn't necessarily know how that space would function. And it's hard to, even with a background in acoustics, to conceive of that beforehand if you don't know anything about the space. So when we think about high-performing spaces in that regard, what are the ways that we can bolster the existing education and the existing vernacular that's associated with constructing high-performing acoustics? It can pull from our current understanding of indoor environmental quality, which is something that Oliver had mentioned before, same with Shane, in terms of the way we interact with physical components. So air quality, light quality, sound, thermal comfort, and all of that being used under the umbrella of IEQ in the context of return on investment. And that leads into the discussion of acoustics and the business case of acoustics. Now, when we think about high-performing spaces and capital in general, organizations have to think about the extent to which their occupants are not only affected by their spaces, but also a key source of revenue, where revenue winds up. And with recent design considerations, we see that the cost associated with design of buildings is only a fraction of what eventually goes into what organizations pay for benefits, wages. And how we account for that in high-performing building design is making sure that we foster those elements that eventually affect occupants, whether that's productivity or other components. And what's frustrating is that there have been some recent publications that focus on the financial case for high-performance buildings. And this one particular publication shall remain nameless, but as it lays out these IEQ parameters as designable approaches for cost-effective and potential ROI for buildings, it identifies the things that we know, feel, smell, breathe, air quality, everything that we've mentioned with IEQ. But it doesn't mention sound. And I found that quite interesting. And I think that there's something to be said about that, but we'll go into that in a second. When we continue to focus on acoustics, many have mentioned so far reference to the World Health Organization's recent, for quite a while now, categorization of noise as a leading public health concern. And that attributes to heart condition, that contributes to risk of stroke, stress increase, cognition. There's also the component of designing a high-performing space to meet neurodiverse needs and basic universal design considerations. So many people have talked about the neurodiversity needs for students who, in certain cases, experience excess stimuli from acoustics, but also focusing on areas within universal design, which is now coming into the building standard lexicon, designing for spaces where non-native speakers listen and speak, where those who are hard of hearing need additional design considerations put into place so that they can function in that space effectively. And so given that there is this growing business and health case and imperative made, where is the platform that addresses both of these? And this need exists to create some sort of mechanism that closes this gap between what designers and experts on a regular basis mention and incorporate into their work as it relates to what we know to be true about how we experience sound. And one example of this is some of the work that I've been a part of in developing the WELL rating system. And the WELL movement in general is something that is a catalyst of amassing what this various research has to say about how we interact in spaces and how they can be designed. And with WELL in particular, we focus on 10 specific concepts. Those range from the IEQ parameters that I mentioned before. We talk about air, light, thermal comfort. We talk about material selection, how that impacts us over time from a toxicity standpoint and how we relate to healthy materials. We have sections that focus on mind, cognition, community, organizational-based policies, and we have a dedicated section on sound. And so we've been able to recognize that sound exists uniquely among this list of things that are perhaps more ubiquitous when we consider health and wellness in general. And sound and well is quite specific. So we address things in terms of requirements and options. Those are called preconditions and optimizations. For sound, we have one precondition, which means it's required for every single project that wishes to pursue WELL certification. Then we have 5 subsequent optimizations. And those focus more on thresholds that are achievable for acoustic performance, ranging from background noise, speech privacy, sound masking, reverberation time control, and impact noise management. But the precondition focuses on something that I would like to focus on, which is acoustic planning. And what does acoustic planning look like? In WELL, we narrow it down to 2 key components. The first, creating a strategic plan that outlines the way that you, as a project and design team, are going to manage and mitigate the various thresholds that we talk about in the subsequent optimizations. That's the first approach. There's an open-ended requirement on that front. There's no thresholds that need to be achieved. The second approach is a bit more specific, and it takes into account the various layouts that you may have in your project and how you specifically label those to function accordingly to your occupant needs using 3 key distinguishers: loud zones, quiet zones, mixed zones. And in recent development, we're adding upon that to include a bit more flexibility based on what we've heard from project teams that have tried to pursue this. But one thing that we found is that in both of these cases, project teams really like to have that choice. They really like to have this ability to focus on what their occupants needs and not be beholden to focusing on any specific threshold in particular. Because in the case of, there are various cases that we can discuss. In the case of, say, a law firm, speech privacy may be the most integral point of design to ensure that that place functions optimally with its acoustical environment. Whereas in the case of a classroom, there may be things that you would like to focus on that relate to universal design, reverberation time control, and ensuring that students are learning and experience positive outcomes in those environments. And so with that in mind, creating that platform through the WELL building standard, but also given what we know about the technical nuances of achieving acoustic thresholds, what is the education that's needed to bolster that vocabulary beyond the acoustical expert world? And it's something that we're trying to focus on right now is how do we build that acumen in the design community and the key stakeholder community so that you can say, I know that this is a main concern with my occupants, and I'm going to design to meet this component and get my project to meet this high performance criteria. One of the first ways I think this needs to take place is by simply not even reinventing the wheel at all. We have a wealth of knowledge in the acoustical expert community that at any given point in a design of a project, ideally as soon as it can possibly happen, but at any point, that individual can help relay and translate the needs of occupants to targetable and implementable acoustical design solutions. But what's important to note is, especially with projects like well-certified spaces, other certification schemes that also highlight acoustic credits. Those programs can be selected and pursued at any given point in the design period of a project. So what does that mean when that golden opportunity to be the acoustician that's working during the schematic design phase of a project, or even sooner, to plan for that, is not available? And I think what's important there is maintaining these platforms where we have these bodies of research, be it from the business development or business case side of high-performing spaces, or most importantly, the health imperative. Ensuring that those platforms that provide the research and linking that to design solutions that ultimately impact people is vastly important. And WELL is only one of the few that target acoustics as a health concern by using performance verifiable metrics through third-party assessment, which I can talk about at another point if you're interested. But also institutions like QuietMark that are able to recognize and acknowledge the achievement of designing with sound as a health imperative through product development in the manufacturing community. And where I see the future of these movements going is, it's been said before, but I'll say it again, is looking into things like occupant surveys, finding ways to develop surveys that offer consistent results over time, such that, say in the case of a well-performing space, if we were able to look at our entire portfolio of well projects in the commercial sector, our occupant surveys are able to demonstrate that these key acoustic design interventions offer this result over time. And one way that that's bolstered is that well certification in particular requires recertification every 3 years. And so in the case of acoustics, that can mean that you're retesting acoustic performance every 3 years. So you're seeing the way that your building performance drifts over time, and in relation to occupant surveys, how people are reacting to that over a given time period. It's very important. And in addition to that, focusing on accountability. When we talk about improving education over time, who needs to be educated? And who benefits the most from that? Are they design teams who continue to develop these spaces? Or are they facilities management who deal with change management all the time through either the implementation of these certification schemes or other high-performing platforms that organizations or buildings utilize on a regular basis as they're developed? All of this to say that there are existing platforms, as I've mentioned, and some others as well, that are really focused on and care about uniting what we know in the research and experience of sound on people to implementable pathways such that we can once and for all make acoustics a ubiquitous element in high-performance design for buildings. And for more information on that, you're welcome to visit wellcertified.com or reach out to me. But I'd like to say thank you for listening.